This is Glass City Humanist on WAKT Radio. This is a show talking about topics of the day from a secular and humanist value perspective. Here is your host, Douglas Berger.
In this episode, I talk about some of the ridiculous rhetoric used by those opposed to State Issue 1. Then we look at yet another attack on the LGBTQ community coming from Columbus. And then finally, we have our interview with Reverend Dr. David Breeden from the First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis.
Glass City Humanist is an outreach of the secular humanists of Western Lake Erie, building community with reason and compassion for a better tomorrow. Views expressed on the Glass City Humanist are not necessarily those of Sholey or WAKT Radio.
Welcome to another edition of the Glass City Humanist on WAKT. I am your host, Doug Berger, and just wanted to take this opportunity to let everybody know that sometimes when you listen to this program on WAKT, you may have heard it before. That's because, unfortunately, I probably bit off a little bit more than I could chew, and it is really hard for me to do an hour each week. And what I've been really focusing on is doing an hour at least every other week. Of course, if health issues arise, since I'm the only one that's producing this program, that might stretch it out. So I apologize in advance if you hear something that's maybe you've heard before because it was on last week. That's just the nature of the game, I guess, when you have pre-recorded programming. So with that out of the way, let's get into the episode for today. There's a couple of things I want to talk about here. Later, we're going to have the full interview that I did with the Reverend Dr. David Breeden from the Minneapolis Unitarian Church, First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis. And that was just published recently in our podcast, Glass City Humanist. And so I'll play the full interview, the full edited interview that I had with him later on. But there's a couple issues that I want to talk about. We have an election coming up in November the 7th. And there's going to be a couple things that can be decided there. If State Issue 1 passes, it would enshrine abortion rights into Ohio's Constitution. Now, obviously, humanists tend to support abortion rights because we believe that it should be only up to the doctor and the pregnant person to decide whether or not to terminate a pregnancy. The state should stay out of it. I think I've discussed before, maybe in other episodes, about the trap laws. One of the trap laws that Ohio had instituted. And I also want to point out, too, that they've done a lot of these regulations through the budget process. And when people do that through the budget process, it's not subject to public referendum. So if there was a bad law that regulated abortion clinics and people were upset about it, and it was done through the budget process, they had to put up with it. And I think that that's totally unfair and undemocratic, but that's what the religious extremists in the Ohio legislature do to get around how people really feel about this issue. Anyway, so if State Issue 1 passes, it will do away with the trap laws. And one of the trap laws that I like to point out to people is that one of the regulations that they had and only for abortion clinics, this only applied to abortion clinics. It did not apply to outpatient surgical clinics, any other outpatient surgical clinics, just abortion clinics. That's why they call it a targeted regulation. And what it required was that in order for an abortion clinic to operate legally in Ohio, they had to have a transfer agreement with a local hospital. Now, the rationale that the religious conservatives in the legislature gave was to protect the safety and welfare of the potential mother, that if something should happen, some kind of medical emergency, that they'd be able to take this person to a hospital and have medical people take care of it. Of course, that failed to consider the fact that all outpatient clinics, anybody that, even dentist offices, if something happens, they call first responders and transport the person to the hospital. So if you're at the dentist office and you're under sedation, and let's say you have a heart attack, they're going to call an ambulance and they're going to take you to the hospital. Everybody that does healthcare has that as part of their ethics, and that's part of the procedure in order for you to remain legal in most states, is you have to be able to do that. So they put that in the law that it had to be a local hospital. Then they added to it that hospitals that receive state funding, which is most nonprofit hospitals that do charity work, like Medicaid, they could not enter into transfer agreements with abortion clinics. So if you look at Toledo, there was only one hospital, private hospital, that could enter into a transfer agreement, and that was ProMedica's Toledo Hospital. The Mercy Health System wouldn't do it because of religious reasons, and that was the only other one besides St. Luke's, which at the time when St. Luke's was open over in Maumee, even though it was called St. Luke's, it wasn't affiliated with any religious order. Anyway, so what the Toledo Clinic did was they contracted with the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, their hospital. Well, Ann Arbor is about 45, 50 miles away from Toledo. So the religious conservatives in the state legislature decided, well, that is getting around our regulation, so we're going to change it. And they added, again, through the budget process, they required that this hospital that you had a transfer agreement be within 30 miles. So that's what they do, is they peck and chip and peck at these regulations to force these clinics out of business. Now, with Roe v. Wade being set aside because of the Dobbs decision, now they don't have to pussyfoot around and do that. But if State Issue 1 passes, all those trap laws will go away. Well, one of the arguments that the anti-choice people are making in their literature, their advertisements that they're sending out to people on social media, is they're pointing out the fact that more black women have abortions than white women. And they infer, and some black people of faith that are opposed to abortion also infer this, if not outright say it, is they claim that it's racial genocide, that these women are being forced to abort their babies because of racism. And that's a diabolical suggestion. It really is, that would happen. Now, it's not implausible, because there have been in history some pretty dubious medical things that have been done to people of color, like the Tuskegee experiments with syphilis, and the one woman that they use her tissues to grow stem cells, and they didn't credit her for decades. Then you had a gynecologist, a white gynecologist, that performed experiments on black women in order to perfect surgical techniques that he then used on white women that wasn't torture, and these black women didn't really consent. So, I mean, if you Google it or whatever, there's tons of it. So, I'm not faulting the black community for being suspicious of abortion providers and for some of them to have this. But the simple fact is it's a numbers game, is what it is. The reason why more black women have abortions in this state and in the country is because more black women are in poverty. And one of the decisions that women make, whether or not to keep pregnancy, is economic reasons. And if you don't think you can support a child, or you have children and you don't think you can support another child, you're more than likely to decide to have an abortion. Now, unlike the anti-choice crowd that's inferring that these women are being forced to terminate, and that's what they're doing in a lot of their talking points about State Issue 1, is they're claiming that people are being forced to have abortions or will be forced to have abortions, that it's an industry looking to make money. All of that is poppycock. But the real thing that we need to deal with is the economic reasons that if you want to reduce abortions, then you have to reduce the social economic reasons that women would want to choose abortions. So if you have a large group of people living in poverty, then you want to improve their economic status, and then they're much more likely then to keep a pregnancy to term. And so that's why the numbers are skewed the way that they are, is because more black people live in poverty than white people. As a percentage of the population, it's black women that have the most abortions racially, in racial terms. So I just wanted to point that out, that when you see that, yes, it's distressing to hear that. And like I said, they do have a point to some of that. But you just have to be careful and check and don't accept what they're saying. Don't accept what your friend tells you on Facebook. Do your own due diligence and look this information up. Because I think it's much more important that women have the right to make their own reproductive decisions, and that the state needs to stay out of it completely. The other thing that I wanted to talk about or mention in this brief time is about there's a House bill that was introduced. I don't remember when it was introduced, but it's under consideration now. And it's going to have an opposition hearing on Wednesday, October the 11th. So depending on when you're listening to this, that's when that hearing took place. You could check that out. It's the Higher Education Committee, Ohio House Higher Education Committee. If you go to the Ohio channel, they have a live stream of all the committee meetings. Check that out. Even if it's past the date, you could still go back and watch it on demand. So it's House Bill 183, and it was introduced by this woman, Representative Lear, and what it would do is it would ban trans people from using the bathrooms that align with their gender identity. Cut and dried. If you are a trans woman, you have to use the men's room. If you are a trans man, you have to use the women's restroom. No doubts about it, and it's going to affect public schools and colleges. And, this is just another targeted attack against the trans community. And it's kind of interesting that the people that are supporting this bill, I can almost promise you they've never talked to a trans person. They've never talked to the trans community. Because I think it's easier for them to discriminate against people when they don't talk to them and they consider them others. And I think that's what happened in this case. But this Representative Lear, oh boy, she really is out there. One of the people on the committee, because she was the proponent, so she was giving testimony. This was on October the 4th. One of the committee members asked her why did they get to this point where they have to consider this and to be a law. And so this is how that conversation turned out.
I'm racking my brain because this seems like a very simple issue to me, and I think you described it that way also. But how did we get here? Like, what is the real crux of this? How did we get to the point where we're having to make this decision and turn it into law?
Through the chair, Representative Willis, thank you for your question. I believe the sexual revolution and its father, Alfred C. Kinsey, are to blame for this largely. Many of our so-called modern ideas about sex come from Kinsey's research. And to be frank, he was a depraved monster. He took small children, including toddlers and infants, into rooms with convicted pedophiles and let the pedophiles work on the children. And he used that information as research to say this is normal sexual behavior for all people. Through that, society has been badly damaged, and the leftists and ACLU who use his research based upon child sex abuse continue to weaken our laws against pornography, rape, and child molestation. So I believe that he and the slipping of our faith in society is largely to blame for what's going on today in our schools.
Yeah. So she was blaming the sexual revolution for trans people wanting to use the bathrooms that align with their gender identity, and that's why we need to get rid of it. That's why we need to make a law against it. Everything that Representative Lear talked about Alfred Kinsey was false. None of it that she talked about was true. And I know if you peel back, I haven't done any real digging, but I know if I peeled back the layers on this woman, I'm going to find a lot of evangelical Christian nationalism and it's just crazy talk. And the fact is that I'm sure she did not write this legislation herself. Usually it's religious conservative lobby groups that basically cut and paste these bills and give them to people that they think will support it. And that's why if you go to different states and look up these different laws, these anti-LGBT laws, that they all look alike. They all have the same wording. And for the most part, it's because they have these lobby groups that just cut and paste these bills. And so I did submit a letter as part of the group Secular Humanists of Western Lake Erie. I did submit some testimony in opposition to House Bill 183. I think it's not needed. In fact, one of the members of the committee is from this area. There's actually two people on the committee that's from this area. You have Derek Marin, who's from Monclova Township, and you have Josh Williams, who represents Point Place and Oregon and some bits and pieces of South Toledo, I think. I forget. And what's funny about it is Representative Williams did a TV interview not long ago because he supports the governor's takeover of the State Board of Education. And basically he said that education policy needs to advance academic progress in students, and that they shouldn't be introducing social issues into the classroom. And so what I'd like to ask him is, how does banning trans people from using the bathrooms that align with their gender identity advance academic progress in students? And how is that not introducing social issues in the classroom? And then, of course, the other issue is, how is this going to be enforced? Are they going to do genital checks? I mean, are they going to have a designated person in the administration of a school? We're talking about a school that would have to check the genitals of students before they use the bathroom. You know, would a parent have to sign a form vouching for the gender of their child? Would you have to have a birth certificate? And so I think what it is this is not going to be really enforced. There's not going to be any mechanism for enforcement. It's going to be on the books. And what it's going to be is it's going to be used to bully trans kids, to call them out, to ridicule them, and bully them. And it'll start with the school. And then the kids, because you'll have, and then you'll have the kids that will say, oh, Timmy, he's a trans man, when Timmy probably is not. And so that's what's going to happen, because we've already seen where they have these Save Women's Sports laws, and in particular in Utah, they had somebody won an athletic competition, and the family of the person that lost filed a complaint and said that the person that won was trans. Wasn't true, but they did that. And so you'll have a lot of people doing that. They'll be using it for spite. And so I hope that people that feel the way that I do about House Bill 183 will contact their elected representatives in Columbus and let them know how you feel about House Bill 183 and about all these targeted attacks against the LGBT community. Because it's got to stop. This religious bigotry has got to stop.
This is Glass City Humanist on WAKT Radio. For more information about the topics in this episode, please visit glasscityhumanist.show.
This is kind of related to the last segment that I just talked about, the House Bill 183. As I said, I had composed some written testimony that I submitted to the committee. And one of the things that I mentioned in there was that I was more fearful of a child being alone with a person of faith, such as a minister or a priest, than I was with a child using a bathroom that just happened to have a transgendered, that happens to have a trans person using it as well. And I mention that because of the large numbers, huge numbers of ministers and priests and religious leaders of various sects that have been credibly accused, arrested, convicted of all manner of type of child abuse, from simple child abuse to molestations, and some of these people had child pornography, were caught with that. We just had recently here in the Toledo area the priest that used to be the head priest at St. Michael's Catholic Church in Findlay. He was arrested and recently convicted of molestation and applying kids with drugs to have sex with them, etc., etc. And I was using this as a comparison that if there were any assault, because this is one of the claims that these people that support these bathroom bills are saying, that kids are in danger because they naturally assume that trans people are pedophiles. You know, it's a false thing, but that's what they say. So I was using it as a comparison that the numbers. There's hardly any trans people that have ever been in trouble for molesting children ever. You know, you see these anecdotes. I mean, some of these right-wingers, they bring up these anecdotes like somebody in England recently was arrested and all that. But the common thread is that ministers and priests and church leaders are more likely to be involved in child abuse than a trans person. So that's why I was using that example. And so I had somebody make a comment, because I posted it on our website, make the comment that I shouldn't use religious bigotry to call out religious bigotry. And so I asked them to explain, and they were saying, well, I know some good people, some good ministers and priests that don't do things like that. And so by you making that example, it's religious bigotry. And I don't agree. I don't agree, because I wasn't saying, unlike the anti-LGBT people, I wasn't inferring that all ministers and priests were pedophiles. I wasn't naturally assuming they were. I was pointing out a factual thing about that there's been these large numbers of people of faith that have been in trouble. Much larger number of people than anybody that's ever been in trouble that's been a trans person. And so if you want to, so it's not bigotry. It'd be the same, it's kind of a similar argument when people say, well, you're being racist to call out my racism. And that's not how it works. That's not how that works. If I call out religious bigotry, I'm not being a bigot to call that out. I'm just pointing out what is going on in real life. And so this person that made these comments, and if you go to the website and to our blog post, you can see, where that person was making that claim, is I don't agree with it. The same when we have discussions that if we examine religious beliefs and we criticize religious beliefs, that in and of itself is not harassment or being a bully. If we're complaining about somebody's religious beliefs, okay, because we're attacking the beliefs. The same with the thing that I pointed out is I was attacking the child abusers. I wasn't saying that all Catholics are pedophiles or all Catholic priests are pedophiles. I would never say that. Unlike the anti-LGBT people who infer it whenever they talk about stuff like this. They always infer that gay people and trans people are pedophiles because they're trying to recruit their children to be gay or trans, which that's not how it works. It's not a simple choice. You're not picking out ice cream flavors, as I like to say. So if somebody takes exception to that and says that I am being a religious bigot, I'm telling you right now that you're wrong. And calling out bad behavior by religious people is not being a religious bigot.
This is Glass City Humanist on WAKT Radio.
Our guest today is the Reverend Dr. David Breeden. He is the senior minister at the First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis. And as a congregational humanist community, FUS fosters a free speech search for knowledge and meaning and strives for justice and serves each other, the Twin Cities and beyond. David has also graduated from the Writers Conference at the University of Iowa. He has a PhD also from the Center for Writers at the University of Southern Mississippi, Master's of Divinity from the Meadville Lombard Theological School, which is the main Unitarian school in the country. And you are the chair of the Education Committee for the American Humanist Association.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to thank you for joining us today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Honored.
Yeah, and I've been wanting to talk to you because when I was looking for material, because I have to program my humanist group and talk to other people about humanism, I'm always looking for material to use or to borrow, as it were. And I came across your liturgy called Congregating for Secular People, Theory and Practice.
Yep.
And I usually blanch at anything that is like a church. I don't go to church. I'm an atheist.
Yep.
But you had a lot of stuff in there that I really liked. Sayings, songs, particular songs, order of service, and particularly the quotes I really liked. And what led you to write and publish that in the first place?
Yeah, well, First Unitarian Society, Minneapolis, became humanist in 1916. And but John Dietrich was the humanist name, and he was called as the minister. So they became the first intentionally humanist, overtly humanist congregation. But back in 1916, really the congregation was still the focus for most Americans in terms of their community. So for Dietrich, what he was really doing was recreating a liturgy, quote unquote, that would be completely humanist. No God talk, no God in the hymns. We call them songs, as a matter of fact. And so really, I'm continuing that tradition that had already developed. and has been going on for well over a century at First Unitarian. But we still do there what I guess would be considered old-fashioned by most humanists today. We basically do a Protestant service, even though we call it an assembly. And it's completely secular, but we do still follow certain rules. We light a candle. I have joys and sorrows. We remember people. And then of course I also do weddings and memorial services, funerals. So there's a lot of occasion for relatively formal language in a liturgical way. Being a poet myself, I really enjoy thinking this through and writing those. So, and I've been fortunate to publish some, and other humanist secular people have used them. So that's very gratifying.
Now, you mentioned it before that the congregation is the focus of a Unitarian church, and you've been using the term, and it was new to me until I heard you use it, congregational humanism.
Yeah.
I'm familiar with religious humanism. Is it the same thing, or is it slightly different?
Well, it's the same thing on a historical continuum. When John Dietrich and others, another Unitarian minister named Curtis Reese was in Des Moines, Iowa. He was doing kind of the same thing, and he would later become the first president of the American Humanist Association. So right there, the two friends essentially who form modern American humanism, Midwestern ministers, went their separate ways early on. Dietrich was always into congregation. He never wrote a book. He only wrote these, what he called addresses, these long talks that he would do. He was always researching. But he stuck with the congregational model. Curtis Reese was not nearly as into that. It's a personal preference thing, really. And so he began looking at ways to spread humanism outside of the Unitarian congregational way of doing it. So he helped form the American Humanist Association. Early on, they did think of those more than just lectures. They also saw them as more in a small congregation model. But that was just not practical for them. There was no training for leaders. There was no certificate program or anything of that nature. And so they just kind of gave up on that idea. And so the American Humanist Association developed as it did. But the term secular humanism wasn't invented until the 1960s. So religious humanism is what you have from the beginning of this idea, this concept. And the 1933, the first Humanist Manifesto talks about religious humanism. And what they really saw themselves doing is they were setting up a counter religion, essentially, right? They were what later would be called the religion of no religion, basically. They were setting that up, and that was what was in their imaginations. But the secular arm of this begins to develop later, and really has become, of course, much more popular. There are many more secular humanists today than religious humanists. But because the term religious humanist was the early one, it also began to sound a little bit antique. And so what's the difference between a secular humanist and a congregational humanist? If you say religious humanist and secular humanist, well, it's the religion that's the difference. But I don't have a religion, even though I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister, but I'm a humanist. I don't do religion in that way. So I now say, well, the difference is that a congregational humanist congregates and a secular humanist doesn't congregate. Right. And
I would agree with that. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But
humanist doesn't normally do church, and congregational humanists typically do church.
Yeah. And in some way, shape, or form. Yeah.
And you mentioned John Dietrich and Carl Reese, right? want to get the name
Curtis,
right.
Curtis Reese.
Curtis Reese. And they met and kind of hatched this new type of religion. Why do you think that it took off, particularly in Minnesota? Because there's a lot of history, humanist history in Minnesota. Why do you think it took off in Minnesota?
Well, yeah, I think I've thought a lot about that, and there's no official, historical reason, but I think I get it. And the reason is that Minnesota is so cold that it was one of the later places that was invaded by Europeans. And the Europeans who came here tended to be from Scandinavian countries. And those Scandinavian countries all tended to have state churches, Lutheran state churches. So when Swedes got here, and when the Finns got here, and the Danes got here, they were all part of this of national churches. But when they got here, they were jumbled up. I mean, we do still have Swedish Lutheran churches; they're around, but those were really from the early settlement period when people were really bringing their social norms to this country. Nowadays, what's the difference in Lutheranism, right? So what happened is when people got here, they were tired of the national religions, and they just said, we're done with that. So actually, they formed a reading group. First Unitarian Society was first part of what was known as the Layman's League, which was formed in the 1870s to fight censorship in the U.S. mail. And then they lost that battle, and then they became a Darwin reading group. And so this group has always been different and always been interested in the kind of cutting edge thinking, not necessarily science, but cutting edge thought. So, yeah. So I think that's probably why. And the same was true in Des Moines, Iowa as well. Very harsh climate, mostly Scandinavians. And then it began to sink in and become popular in Chicago at the University of Chicago, which has always been a very important theological school in the U.S.
The Unitarian Universalist Association, which your church and you are a part of, are revising their bylaws, working on revising their bylaws.
Yep.
I recently, a few months ago, interviewed Michael Werner, who's a longtime Unitarian and past president of the AHA.
Yep, I know Michael.
And he believes that it's an effort to that the effort to update the church's bylaws will extinguish the strong history of humanism and leave the church open to the evils of postmodernism. That's his thing, postmodernism. And he also believes that the church is abandoning Enlightenment principles of reason, science, tolerance, affirming the inherent worth of all people and replacing it with the work on social and racial justice. What do you think about the proposed revisions, and what would you say to members like Michael about it?
Yeah. Well, I've had various humanists around the country ask me about this. Since I'm a known humanist in the movement, I have just the exact opposite reaction, to be honest with you. I think that it's the victory of secularism and humanism because it doesn't. This new document does not mention humanism. It also doesn't use the term religion.
Right.
So it's essentially a sociological document. Now, we humanists tend to think that most religious problems are actually a subject for psychology, don't we? And don't we think social problems are the work of nonprofits, of working with government to improve things? That's what the new bylaws talk about. So I say we won. I would argue that every liberal, Presbyterian, Methodist, whatever, any liberal in the United States, I would argue, is a little H humanist, right? Because you have to accept multiculturalism in order to be a liberal, basically, right? and that's what this document is doing. It's a little H humanist document that I believe builds the way for increased humanist uh, efforts in the future. I mean, many UUs developed sometime in the 1980s and 1990s the attitude that humanism was old-fashioned. And the reason I think for that is that our humanists in UUism tended to be disconnected from the larger humanist movement, which is not much like it was in 1950. And so they simply lost the plot, as it were. And we have, I think, gone on from there. In terms of postmodernism, I consider myself a postmodernist. Wittgenstein is my hero, and so I can't argue against postmodernism. I think, yeah, in one way, it questioned science, yes, but it questioned science in some very positive ways, I believe. It caused a lot of misunderstanding. But if you really get into the depths of postmodernism, it's acting as a corrective to a kind of overweening structuralism that is very Western based and very reason based. On the other hand, I'm talking too long, but on the other hand, I do, even though the Enlightenment, I think we should always be very, very suspicious of the Enlightenment because it did power some real atrocities in the world. There's no doubt that it did. Mm-hmm. And the scientism that grew up out of that proved, quote unquote, that women were inferior, that, et cetera, just some really horrendous, awful things. But our central principle is the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and that is an enlightenment. Christianity never said that. That's humanism. Right. That's humanism. Christianity would never say that, but humanism does say that, and we have to hold on to that. If there's one thing that the Western world did for humanity before we died out tomorrow or whatever, it would be that we insisted that the individual is a being unto themselves and free therefore. And that's that is a truly revolutionary, enlightened thing to think.
Yeah, and I understand Michael's point that the word humanism will not be in the bylaws in the right. proposed change, but I read the proposal, and many of the points sounded like humanism to me, even if it wasn't saying this is humanism.
Right.
Right. And I right. think that people miss that point.
Right. Well, and it's the because. I mean, if the United Methodists were to write that, they would be doing good in the world because God, right? Mm-hmm. And they would be acting ethically because God. Well, that's not in there, and that is in the religion business. That is a big darn victory. So, and it took a century to do it.
You just recently received the Humanist Distinguished Service Award at the this year's AHA conference.
Yep.
And in your speech, you said at one point, humanists will always quibble, but at the foundation of humanist ethics are four assertions and aspirations. Humanists call you in to trust that human beings matter more than ideas. Mm-hmm. Each and every person is precious and unique, having unique human genetic and social composition and individual rights and collective responsibilities.
Yep.
Freedom of speech and thought are essential to human flourishing, and human beings can solve human problems. Our goal is flourishing for all sentient beings. And I think that's just a great summary of what humanism aspires to.
Yeah.
Does it trouble you today how some people will put politics above the dignity and worth of other people? And what do you think we should do about that?
Yeah, well, that's the love your neighbor as yourself is a wonderful thing to start with, but if you say human beings matter more than ideas, there's not a lot more to fight about, right?
Right.
They need to be killed because they are blank cannot occur in that, or this is a surgical strike just to kill blank. No, human ideas, all human ideas, from the sacred to the profane, from the sublime to the ridiculous, it's all human, and we're all human together. So if we can only say, you're human first, I have great compassion for you. Now let's talk. Being human, I just don't see it as full of problems as, I mean, what matter? I don't care if I'm a communist, if I'm a fascist, if I'm a loving human being who also believes in a particular social structure, as long as I'm working in a democratic fashion for that social structure, that's what we call freedom, right?
Right.
I mean, I can be completely convinced that communism is the only way, and as long as I'm working within the system and in the marketplace of ideas, it's when you start suppressing ideas that things get nasty, right? So
right. And I also noted too in the conference speech, and this was published in the Humanist magazine, an excerpt from it. You told the story of Mary Midgley. Did I get that last name right?
Yep.
And she wrote in her last book, "It is that all solutions are incomplete for reasons that can often be understood. The area of our ignorance is enormous, and by its very nature has no outward frontiers." Now, she wasn't saying that we accept all points of view without question.
Nope.
Only that we need to have more points of view when trying to solve some issues. Is that what she and you indirectly were saying? Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. The idea that everything is true is spurious at best. But I mean, what the Cambridge women, of that generation, the World War II generation, they were students, and they were able to be real students in the university because of World War II, and the men were mostly gone. And so suddenly women had a voice for the first time in a major university that people were listening to. And they were very clear, wait a minute, your virtue ethics may just lead you to being a really good Nazi. Let's think about this. Let's think of the outcome of your actions, and so, they began to apply things from what was at that time seen as the feminine arts, right? That, the parlor, the kitchen, and nowadays we don't see it that way, but we don't see it that way because of them, right? So there you go, right?
Now, and I always tell people, probably not phrasing it this distinctly, all our solutions are incomplete. Usually I just say all our ideas are open to question. If that's the case, how does a humanist get through our day? Doesn't it seem like we're hitting our head on a wall if all our solutions are incomplete?
Nope, because it's just so very cool to keep going. I literally showed a headline from the New York Times the other day on the screen at First Unitarian, and it said all of our thinking about the cosmos may be wrong, and it was about what the new telescopes are showing us that are contradictions in the models that we've had. And I said, how does that make you feel? And because it makes me feel cool. I mean, wow, man. Everything I've learned about the universe, may be wrong. I mean, how cool is that? If I were a high schooler, I'd be signing up, for astrophysics classes right now. I mean, that's the future, man, right?
Right.
I mean, how amazing. But we know that, when certain scientists went to the Pope did not think that.
Right. I mean, he had them murdered or
Right.
or put in
House
prison.
arrest and all that. Yeah. So the news for the fundamentalist that all of our ideas are wrong is always dangerous. But for us, I think it opens up the world of possibility. I'm really excited by the facts of the ideas and the tools that are opening up for us.
And we do know that some solutions in the world could work. But why do you think that some people and some governments are too afraid to implement them, such as reducing poverty, that sort of thing?
Right.
Why aren't we rushing to solve all these problems that we know we can solve?
Well, I do think that is an interesting question. I'm looking around. There's a book that I'm going to try to work on this year. I don't see it, but it's called Poverty by America. I don't remember the author, but it came out fairly recently, and it talks about how we have created social class systems as we have created them. I come from the working class myself and worked so that I could go to school and could learn and all those things. I am totally dedicated to the idea of John Stuart Mill that an individual is not actually free until they can make their own decisions about how they wish to live in life. You have to have some ability, some background, some knowledge in order to do that. And how many Americans just go with their parents' religion, or just with or stay within their social class and the oppressive circumstances, only because it's so darn hard to get out, for one thing, right? But yeah, so I think we have to develop a society in which the average person has the ability to decide for themselves what would make their life have meaning and purpose.
Yeah, because your
Mhm.
family's from a family of farmers. You'd still be a farmer
Yep.
today if you didn't
Yep.
get out in the world and see what was going on, right?
Exactly. So, and everyone needs to have that opportunity to get outside. And in America, our class system works on what you do, right? We don't have a born peon, but we do have people who are born that probably are going to drop out of high school or just finish high school. And we're going to assign them jobs that, for the most part, keep them within a narrow range of economic possibilities all their lives, right? So within that structure, what choices do you have, right? And so, to me anyway, we must guarantee human flourishing. How we do that is the question, right? And unfortunately, the white upper middle class has hoarded those those privileges. I mean, that's what all of this college stuff, admission stuff is about now. We all knew that all along. In order to be upper middle class, you have to keep achieving. It's not like royalty where you're just born that way, And so that striving has led to an extreme social distance between us,
And I noted in your biography that you graduated from the Iowa Writers Workshop. I can't
Yep.
believe I couldn't remember it.
Yep.
And I am so jealous because I dreamed in my younger days of doing that.
Yeah.
Do you get more satisfaction writing or speaking during your services?
Oh, wow. Oh, that's interesting. I was also a disc jockey in my earlier days. That's how I worked my way through school back in the day. I see them as totally different. I see the vocal as a performance, and I approach it as a performance, just as I would approach spoken word poetry as a performance. So I think it through. I think I just naturally wave my hands around because I grew up Pentecostal, so we just move. That's just what you do, But I see that as a vocal performance. And I love writing because I see that as, a writing performance. And, but no, poetry has always been my first love, and I write poetry almost every day. So it's a
cool.
practice. Yeah. Yeah.
And finally, if we haven't talked about it yet, or maybe we did, what is one major point you think that people considering humanism should know about it?
The major point for people to remember is that there are many humanisms. Because humanism is flowing from the human rather than flowing from some presumed, white guy in the sky, because it's flowing from the human, and every human is unique. So how we express our humanism is going to be unique. Nigerian humanism is not going to be like Brazilian humanism, is not going to be like Midwestern humanism, is not going to be like East Coast humanism. Humanism is, it always ought to have an S on it in that way, right? There are many humanisms. And we have to forget about the atheist or non-theist thing, I think. What we have to focus on is human agency. Do you believe that we together can change things for the better? If you believe that, join in. And I see our future much more as the religion of no religion than being an alternative religion, as my predecessor John Dietrich saw it. I don't see us that way anymore. We are the religion of no religion.
And I also noted too on the website for the Unitarian Society, you've been digitizing John Dietrich's sermons or talks or whatever he gave.
Yeah, he called them addresses. No,
addresses.
I just absolutely, he was reading everything. And so he's absolutely fascinating. And another thing that people don't necessarily remember, both Dietrich and Reese grew up in German-speaking homes. Mm-hmm. And I have a suspicion that's how they got together. They were German boys who liked their beer, probably. But Dietrich was able, because, in the early AM radio days of the 20s and 30s, people could listen to shortwave radio. So you could listen to European radio. So Dietrich was listening to Adolf Hitler early, and he knew this guy was a shyster from the beginning. And so to read his material as with the rise of Hitler is absolutely fascinating, because here's a guy who got it.
that was one of the things that I noticed too, especially when reading Manifesto 1, that it was kind of a response to fascism. Yeah.
We are going to create the fair and democratic, Curtis Reese, before he called it humanism, he called it the religion of democracy. Mm-hmm. And he believed that thinking democratically fundamentally changes our ways of thinking. And I on my good days, I believe that.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you spending time with us today, and you've got a really positive outlook, which I like, and it's always a pleasure to talk to somebody who knows their humanist history, and and hopefully the changes in the association don't cause too much trouble as they move along, because I know it's a long process.
Yeah.
And I really do. I really appreciate you joining us today.
Well, keep it up. Humanism is the way toward a flourishing life. So welcome everyone to it.
Thank you for listening. For more information about the topics in this episode, please visit glasscityhumanist.show. See you next time.